Welcome back to Proxhammer, everybody. And today we're going to be doing a video about how to screen your Craftworld Eldar from enemy reinforcements. And we're going to be looking at a few tips and tricks for keeping your Craftworld Eldar alive against reserves. Now, as most of you know, reserves can kind of be hard to prevent, right? Especially if your enemy relies on reserves a lot. It can be hard to know when and where to move your forces because you don't know how much damage they are going to be able to do to you when they come in, and it can kind of be hard to gauge if you should move or not, right? And a lot of times what will happen is if you're going against an opponent with a lot of reserve elements, you will play a lot more cautiously, and sometimes if you don't exactly know how to place your units, you could either wind up corner camping or overextending, and this could obviously lead to a lot of damage being done to you. Now, reserves is something that I have learned over the years throughout every edition to know how to prevent. And typically it's always been that it's easier to prevent things when you keep your army together. And the reason why is when units come out of reinforcements, they need to be a specific distance away from enemy units, right? Now, this has kind of been the case throughout every single edition where units need to be careful about where they go, because if they go too close as reinforcements, they might be in danger, right? Well, now you automatically are placed wherever you decide. So how exactly do we prevent units from coming in and just devastating our forces, right? Now, this is going to be very hard to do, especially if your enemy has, units upon units of reserves that come in all together at once. It can be very overwhelming. And it's good to know how to prevent these things from happening, and at the same time, still, go on with the battle business as usual, being able to take objective points, being able to destroy units, and so forth. Because as we know, Eldar is kind of like a machine. Every piece of the army works together and synergizes with other pieces of the army. So reserve elements from your enemy can take out a crucial part of your machine and really damage you a whole lot if you're not careful. A well-placed enemy attack, especially from reinforcements, can often be devastating if you're not prepared for it. So let's go into it and let's try to talk about a couple ways in which you can prevent this so that you can continue business as usual against most enemy armies. So what we're going to be doing in this video is we're going to be looking at basically four things. We're going to be looking at the basics of how to deny board space to your opponent's reserves. We're going to be looking at how to stop a drop pod assault and other turn one reserve abilities that are available to enemy units from the first turn, especially drop pods and things like that, just like our Falcon can deep strike during turn one as well. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at how to prevent an opponent's reserves later in the game on turns 2 and 3, where, you have to move up your army and, start to capture objectives and so forth. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at using counter reserves to hinder your opponent's ability to go all in on you at any given moment. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to deny board space to your opponent's reserve elements. Now, the first thing you have to understand when looking at how to deny board space to your opponent is the basic rules of reserves, which most reserves need to land outside of 9 inches of enemy troops. And that goes for your opponent as well. Unless he has some sort of special rule on some of his models, he needs to be outside of 9 inches. And I think the only models that ignore this 9-inch rule may be some of the figures from the assassin range of the Imperium. So, like the Vindicare Assassin or the Colus Assassin, things like that. I don't think the Vindicare does, but I think one of those assassins can ignore that 9-inch rule, I believe. Now, if you place your troops correctly, This will give you a good amount of space to be able to ignore a lot of your opponent's reserves. So what you want to really do is you want to space your forces out about 18 inches from each other. So each unit should be at least 18 inches or a little bit less if you want to, away from each other. And that way, it's going to be really hard for enemy units to actually deep strike within your army or get behind you and stuff like that. So this will give you a good amount of space to both avoid ranged firepower as well as enemy assaults on your most precious units. Also, use board edges where possible to avoid deep striking reserves as well. However, do watch out for strategic reserves. Make sure that your units aren't too close to the enemy deployment zone board edge, because sometimes if you do this, enemy units can come from strategic reserve and they can come from a board edge and really ruin your day. Now, those are some general tips to how to stop reserves. But how do you stop a drop pod assault and other turn one reserve abilities, right? Because they come in on the first turn, you're not going to have much room to actually deploy. And you could very well find yourself stuck in a corner of the board, not being able to get out for the entire game. So the key to stopping a drop pod assault is this. You need to deploy your forces together. 1. Then you need to screen your army with units like Rangers and Guardians. Yes, if you're running Guardians, I'm sorry. If your opponent has a reserve heavy list, your Guardians are probably going to be dead anyway. The best thing you can do with them is to use them as a screening unit so that they don't actually get at your more valuable units. Same thing with Rangers. I know Rangers, people like to keep them alive and stuff like that, but if you're fighting an enemy army with a lot of reserve elements, your Rangers are going to be extremely hard to protect anyway, so you might as well use them in a defensive capacity. So these kind of turn one reserves are actually, believe it or not, one of the easiest to prevent if you have units like Rangers and Guardians, especially Rangers, as you will have all your screening units alive from the beginning of the battle, and in most cases, you will be having your forces together and not having to worry so much about objectives. Because again, you can't start scoring until turn 2. So if we look at this diagram here, basically we have a couple of tanks in the back. Those could be our fire prisms or whatever, right? And then we have Rangers. Now, the Rangers are the small dots. The oval-like shapes are your characters. So if you notice here, I put these transparent circles on there, right? Now, what this is this is basically representing the areas in which your opponent cannot deep strike in. And actually, I know there's a little space in the corners as well on the top left and the bottom left. Your opponent actually can't get there either if you place your units correctly. So use your Rangers with advanced deployment to surround your most vulnerable units so that your opponent will be forced to deploy on the opposite side of the obscuring terrain on the left-hand side of the board. And when your opponent does this, right, the only good targets that your opponent is going to have are Rangers, and that's it. He or she is not going to be able to successfully attack your fire prisms or your characters and be able to essentially take control of the battle from turn 1. And what this does is basically this just sets up a normal battle scenario where you have an enemy unit in front of the ruins that you can then deal with as you please and make it a little bit more manageable. And this is very easy to get around. Now, what your opponent could either do, a savvy opponent will actually not choose to go in turn 1 with his drop pods if you deploy this way. A lot of savvy players will keep their drop pods in reserve, but this also works to your advantage because now you don't have to worry about getting alpha striked on turn 1, right? Your units are going to survive for another turn. But it also means that you're going to have to worry about your opponent's reserves later in the game. Turn 2, turn 3. Well, just turn 2 and turn 3. Because remember, after turn 3, everything that's in reserve still dies. So your opponent at least has to bring them in on turn 3. But your opponent could easily delay that a couple turns if they wanted to. So a savvy opponent will actually be patient with this, but if your opponent is okay with the fact that he's not going to be able to kill anything but rangers, then they might come down anyway with their drop pods, or 2, 3, 4 drop pods or whatever they have, and unload their guys and obliterate your rangers probably. Now, if this is the case, this is actually great, because not only does this allow you to escape the wrath of most of those units in those drop pods, which probably had a good amount of anti-tank tech, but it also puts the enemy in an awkward position where you can just come out and absolutely destroy enemy units, right? It puts enemy units in assault range of things like striking scorpions, howling banshees, and wave serpents. It puts things in range of dire avengers and all sorts of short range, devastating firepower units that you might have in your list. So this could really work out to your advantage, but you need to make sure that from turn 1, your opponent is not able to get at those most vulnerable areas of your army. So when you're deploying on the first turn, keep your army together, keep your most vulnerable units behind obscuring terrain, and then cover the areas of the board in which you know your opponent can come in to get around the obscuring terrain, either on the left side of the ruins or the right side of the ruins, which are both, as you can see, covered by ranger units so that your opponent can't do that. I have seen opponents many times drop pods behind an enemy army in the enemy deployment zone and absolutely just wreck everything in that area, right? Especially if you can get behind the ruins, there's very little chance that your fire prisms or whatever are going to survive. So make sure that you deploy in such a way that there is no space for your opponent to put a drop pod in there. So just remember that he needs to be more than 9 inches away. So if you at least have one unit covering those areas and spread it out a little bit, you should be fine. And I know what some of you may be thinking. Well, Proxy Hammer, I know that it's pretty easy to deny enemy first turn reinforcements because I have all my troops alive. And, obviously it's the first turn of the game. But what about preventing opponents' reserves later in the game, in turns 2 and 3? Now, albeit, it's much harder to do this, and it might not be entirely possible to stop everything. However, there is a way to do it in the first couple turns by basically moving your screening units up with the rest of your forces, right? Empty wave serpents, vipers, rangers, guardians, etc. all make great screening units for the rest of your army. For strategic reserves, you have to stay close to the table edge, but not the enemy board edge. So that means their deployment zone and their board edge, right? Because enemy units from strategic reserve can actually come in on their own deployment zone in their board edge within engagement range. And remember, strategic reserves can be placed within 6 inches of a board edge. So they still have to be outside of 9 inches unless it's, again, the enemy deployment zone board edge, in which case they can be deployed within engagement range. So you can actually get caught unaware by this. So be very careful when deploying in that area. Now let's look at this first scenario here. We have a diagram of an enemy army that has camped out in the opposite ruins, and they have a lot of reserve elements coming in on turn 2, and you have to prepare for it. So what you're going to do is you're going to move your forces up into that structure. Your rangers are behind your squad of dire avengers or swooping hawks or whatever that came in there. And it's probably going to be dire avengers, right? Something in a wave serpent that can shoot very well. And by placing screening units about 18 inches or less apart, away from your dire avengers and the middle of the board, the units in that structure right there, you can effectively screen your entire force from enemy reserves. And you can use the board edge as additional protection, because remember, units can't obviously deploy outside of the board, right? So you can safely use the board edge against traditional type reserves, not strategic reserves, but traditional reserves, to deny them. So things like deep striking units and things like that won't be able to get to your dire avengers very easily. Now, as you can see, the fire prisons in the back are also covered. We have one farseer or character that we left behind back there to screen out the back line. That character is within 3 inches of the fire prism, and behind obscuring terrain for the most part, so it still won't be able to be shot at. We have rangers on the right in that bottom right corner to basically protect the right flank of the fire prism position. And we have a wave serpent right in front of the enemy ruins on the right-hand side to protect our right flank. And lastly, of course, we have another wave serpent or viper or whatever in the enemy deployment zone to protect ourselves from enemy reinforcements coming up that way, right? So if this is the end of your movement phase, you're going to start shooting, you're going to kill a lot of enemy models, especially in those ruins, you're going to pin your enemy down, and guess what? Your opponent is not going to be able to respond in the way they would like to. And they're going to have to basically either deploy behind the ruins and stick themselves in a bad position, right? In a position where they're getting pinned down and they're going to continue to be pinned down by your army, or they have to deploy on the right-hand side of all these units, far enough away so that they can't really touch your Dire Avengers and other shooting elements. Now, your Wave Serpents probably will be exposed by this, and a couple of them will probably get either seriously injured or die. But that's the thing. That's what Wave Serpents are used for, and that's what screening units are used for typically. Now, the thing is, you can also do this with units that are not Wave Serpents. Right? You can do this with units like Guardians. You can do this with units like, Rangers moving up and then advancing into a screening position if you need to. You can do this with things like, I don't recommend it, but you can do this with things like Swooping Hawks, things like that if you need to. Now, I know that a lot of people don't run Wave Serpents nowadays. I think Wave Serpents are an excellent denial tool personally, and basically form of protection for a lot of your units, but you can easily use other units for the purposes of screening. I particularly like units like Guardians. Guardians can move 7 inches and then advance to get into a position. Guardians can be used as reserves themselves to be put in a screening position. Rangers can use advanced positions to get into a place where they can, screen out your army and so forth. But basically what you want to do is you just want to put units in positions 18 inches away from other friendly units so that no one can basically get to you, right? And if you use this diagram as a general guide on how to do that, you can easily replace those Wave Serpents on the top and the right-hand side of the board with other screening elements like Guardians or Rangers. Now, what about Strategic Reserve? So Strategic Reserve is a little bit different, and it's available to every single army, whether or not they have Deep Strikers. So normal units can use Strategic Reserves to come in on board edges. So enemy units in Strategic Reserve still need to deploy 9 inches away from enemy units. They're still basically locked into that restriction, right? So Strategic Reserves, in my mind, are actually slightly easier to prevent because of it. Now, if you position 2 units, and usually all you need for this is 2 units, whether it be Rangers, Guardians, whatever. And if you have a big unit of Guardians, like a squad of 20, you can actually do this with just 1 unit. But essentially what you're going to do is you're just going to line up your unit about 9 inches away from where your opponent can come in on the board edge. So if you measure about 9 inches away from the board edge and you deploy your units in a line, right, up until the enemy deployment zone like we have here, your opponent is not going to be able to come into reserve in those areas. Now, I drew lines to represent the area in which your opponents cannot come in, right? So on the bottom left, you see that line basically pointing down that is touching the border of the board edge. Your enemy units cannot deploy anywhere in that zone right there. So all of those areas are safe, and basically what your opponent is going to have to do at that point is either come in on the other side of the board, or your opponent is going to have to come in on their own deployment zone. And again, they're facing the same problem as they did last time, which is they're not really being able to use their reserves in a way that's advantageous to them, and they've lost not only turns of shooting, but they've lost a better position, right? Because if they had deployed normally, they might have had a better position on the battlefield. And as you can see, there's just no way for your enemy to engage you without having to either come in behind the ruins, behind the forest in their deployment zone, or just come in on the other side of the board edge. So basically, enemy units in strategic reserve are going to have a really hard time deploying on this side of the board or the battlefield, and this will ensure that your flank is secure so that you can continue to press the attack without having to worry about being outflanked. So again, as you can see, a lot of the elements of this army are in fact deployed together, right? And the reason why I say deploy your forces together is it makes it much easier for you to actually screen out your most important units. If you spread your army out a lot, your opponent, if they're reserve heavy, are going to absolutely pick your units apart one by one. And this is coming from somebody who's played every single edition since 3rd edition, basically, and reserves have always been a big part of the game. And they've always been a part of the game that opponents really like to use. And just players in general really like to use reserves, right? Reserves can be very effective. But if you know how to counter them properly, they can be actually, in some cases, a detriment to your opponent because they're losing out on turns in which they could be shooting you, right? Now, I do want to address one thing, and I want to address counter reserves as well. So many of you might be thinking, well, what about units that come in reserve as a result of your own reserve? So units like death marks, Necron death marks. Now, the thing about these type of units that come in as a result of your own reserves coming in, it kind of follows the same thing. Now, Necron death marks are a little bit of a tougher unit to stop because they have a very far range. They're basically snipers, right? So they're a little harder to stop, but also remember, though, that if your opponent is using a lot of death marks are not a unit that can ignore line of sight. So when you're deploying your forces and you know that your enemy is going to have something like this where he can come in after your own reinforcements and shoot at you for free, the best thing to do in these scenarios is deploy your reinforcements within your own army, within the bubble of protection that you have, so that it's much harder for your opponent to actually come in range to actually shoot them. Or be able to get line of sight on those units. So, for example, if we're looking at the previous situation where we had those bubbles of area denial, your opponent still has to abide by those rules. So if you bring in a friendly unit from reserves, from deep striking or whatever, either behind obscuring terrain or within those bubbles of protection, your opponent is going to have to deploy very far away from that area and might have trouble still getting those free shots on that unit. Now, the other cool thing about this is, let's say that you have a squad of 5 warp spiders or 5 swooping hawks that comes in, and you bring them into the middle of your forces that are protected by your reserve bubbles, right, at the end of the movement phase. And your opponent decides to bring in 10 death marks to shoot them off. He is going to have to position his death marks in a way in where he can both see your swooping hawks or reserve unit, or he's going to have to deploy them in a position that is maybe less favorable to the death marks, an exposed position to be able to get line of sight. And trust me, every single time, if you bring in a unit of reserves like swooping hawks and they bring in 10 death marks against you or something like that, 10 death marks is much, much more expensive, point for point, than 5 swooping hawks. So if your opponent actually wants to come in and spend all the resources placing himself in a position to where he can actually shoot your swooping hawks, and again, you could always just deploy them behind line of sight, right? You can deploy them behind the ruins and your opponent will not be able to get to you. But if you come in somewhere else, he's basically going to downtrade against you. And once that happens, once his unit's exposed, you can then take it out from there. So on a personal level, I've gone up against death marks a few times, and if you are able to mitigate their ability to basically hit your best units when coming from reserve, if you're able to mitigate that with obscuring terrain or area denial abilities, it's going to be extremely hard for them to do anything. And Also remember that even though they do have significant shooting ability, they do not ignore things like obscuring terrain and just terrain in general, right? Their weapons are pretty decent. I think they're like strength 5 and AP -1 or something like that. And they have basically the sniper ability where they can deal mortal wounds on 6 to wound. But that's often not going to be enough to kill an entire Eldar unit. And again, most of the time you can deploy your units in such a way where your opponent is going to have to spend more resources to actually kill that unit than what the unit cost originally, what your unit cost originally. Remember, death marks are quite, quite expensive, point for point. So again, if your opponent is using a lot of these abilities, then it might be better to just deploy behind obscuring terrain with your unit so that your opponent's death marks can't get you. Now, the other thing you could do is just not put things in reserve at all, right? Units like Swooping Hawks can easily just deploy normally, right? You could just deploy them on foot and they can use things like Skyleap to get around. So again, there are many cases where death marks, especially their counter reserve ability, is just not going to be effective, and you can definitely make it even less effective by utilizing movement, area denial tactics, and terrain, as well as just not putting your units in reserve in the first place. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is not something I can typically show you on a diagram, but it involves what you have in reserve. So this is going to be using counter reserves to hinder your opponent's ability to go all in. So basically what this hinges on is placing your own units in reserve to hinder your opponent's ability to alpha strike you. So when you have units in reserve, it's sometimes tempting to just bring them in as soon as possible. But if you know that your enemy has a lot of reserves as well, and if you go second, then your opponent is going to be forced to bring his units in before you bring your units in on turn 3, right? And then at that point, you can counter him during your turn 3 and basically reverse the tables. Get the counter strike on his army. Now, if you go first, you can at least delay your opponent's eventual reinforcements, buying you a turn of grace in which you're free from enemy reserves for at least another turn. Now, the idea behind keeping your own units back in reinforcements as well is this often makes your opponent think more critically about when and where he wants to place his reinforcements, right? If your opponent knows you have reserve units, is he really going to deploy his big unit of Tau battlesuits in a position where your Shining Spears can come in the next turn and assault them right away? Probably not. Right? So he's going to try to deploy probably in a safer position, more close to his other troops so that he can screen your unit of Shining Spears out. Now, the advantage to this, obviously, is that that unit of battlesuits might not have the best targets anymore. They might not be able to get at the juiciest targets of your army, and they might have to just settle with shooting at things like wave serpents or stuff like that, or rangers or things like that, which isn't the best use of expensive units of battlesuits. If your opponent is forced into a position where he has to drop his unit of crisis battlesuits outside of range of all your good units and needs to shoot at rangers, oh man, you already have basically won the battle, because he is not going to be able to make up the points cost of that battlesuit unit before you destroy them, right? Now, again, battlesuits are deadly, but I think the best thing about battlesuits is they get an alpha strike on you in the beginning. And then once they get that alpha strike, there's not enough elements in your army typically to be able to strike back. However, when your opponent comes in and can only shoot at rangers and only kill 65 points worth of models when they're spending well over probably 300 points on their own battlesuits, and you destroy that unit, you are going to be putting your opponent in a very tough position. So, again, the way you can really make your opponent think more critically about where they place their reinforcements and when they place the reinforcements is if you're using counter reserves, if you have your own units in reserve yourself, to be able to counter whatever comes in, right? And a lot of the times your opponent is actually going to be cognizant of your reserves as well and might space out their reserves accordingly and not just bring them all in at once to alpha strike you. And this can also be to your advantage as well, because this allows you to take on the opponent's army piece by piece instead of all at once. So for example, if your opponent has 4 units of reserve coming in, it's much better to deal with them as, in turn 2, dealing with a couple reinforcement units, and then in turn 3, dealing with a couple of reinforcement units. It's much easier to do that than to deal with 4 units all at once. And that way, at least, you can kind of space it out a little bit and prevent a lot of your opponent's potential damage as well. So in conclusion, I think being able to screen out enemy reinforcements properly in the first few turns can not only keep your most vulnerable units and most important units safe, but also prevent a potentially fatal alpha strike on your army. Now, when I first started playing this game years and years and years ago, the first time I learned about what deep strike was the last time I really tried to allow it to happen. Because what happened was the enemy army used deep strike to get really close to my forces, to get behind my forces, and they actually just totally wrecked my wave serpents. And back in the day in 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition, if you landed behind a wave serpent, they weren't protected by any special abilities or anything like that, and they had very low armor and were very easy to kill. So back then, if you left your backline open and you left your wave serpent's rear armor open, the enemy unit could basically destroy your wave serpent pretty instantly. So that's exactly what happened to me. An enemy unit dropped a unit of assault marines with 2 melta-guns behind me, and I absolutely got destroyed. So from then on, I was very aware of what enemy reinforcements could do, what the enemy had in reinforcements to begin with, and that is also something that you should always ask your opponent. When your opponent is setting up reserves, always make sure that you're clear with your opponent about what is in reserves for him or her and what is in reserves for you, right? You always want to make sure that that's the case going into it. You do not want to be surprised with a unit of crisis battle suits with fusion guns, right? Like, oh, I thought those were plasma rifles. They have plasma rifles model on them. Oh, no, I'm proxying them for fusion guns. Fusion guns, excuse me. Need to probably drink some water. But yeah, so you just want to make sure about what your opponent has in reserves and just be clear on that from the beginning of the game. And by using board space denial, counter reserves, and other tactics, you can often minimize the threat of enemy reinforcements, and in some cases, actually turn enemy reinforcements into a disadvantage for your opponent. Because remember, if you are denying large areas of the board for your opponent to come in, your opponent probably would have been better off just deploying normally in some terrain on his deployment zone or something like that in most cases, right? If you deploy correctly, your opponent won't be able to assault you very easily or won't be able to assault good units out of reserve, won't be able to get your most vulnerable and best units easily. So again, if you follow these general guidelines, you should be fine against enemy reserves, and even armies like crisis battlesuit lists will have trouble getting to your most vulnerable spots and will often waste their shooting on things like rangers or wave serpents. And I know a lot of you are thinking, well, wave serpents are a valuable unit. Yes, they are, but they're not as valuable as your aspect warriors because they just don't do the same amount of damage and they don't have the same amount of impact in that way as aspect warriors do. But what they are great at, and I detailed this in another video where I talk about wave serpents, is they're great at denying both enemy reinforcements from coming in and being used as a screening unit, and also being placed in front of enemy units that you think are going to assault your troops. They're great at denying assaults and reinforcements as well. So I think personally that's the best way to use wave serpents once they disembark their troops. And here's my other recommendation for you guys. Make sure that when you're using wave serpents to screen out units, that you're using them as empty wave serpents. Now, what I mean by this is dropping off your unit beforehand, moving your unit into a safe position, and then moving your Wave Serpent into a space where they can deny enemy reinforcements. Because if your opponent is able to shoot your Wave Serpent and kill it, and that Wave Serpent still has Dire Avengers or Howling Banshees inside, you can be sure that they're going to be in a very vulnerable spot, and a lot of times your opponent can follow up with another unit coming from reserve or a unit that he has in ruins or something like that can then shoot your unit that has just been disembarked from that destroyed transport. So do be careful about that. Don't use occupied Wave Serpents to screen unless you know for a fact that your opponent has nothing to take out that Wave Serpent. All right, everybody. That's going to be it for today's video on screening. I hope you guys enjoyed it and learned a little bit of something from it. Have a good one, everybody. If you do have comments, questions, or little tips and tricks for other Eldar players that you have learned throughout your games, please leave them in the comment section. I love, obviously, of course, reading your comments and responding to all of them. So, yeah, leave some comments. I'm more than happy to take a look at them. And I think a lot of times, believe it or not, your comments are actually helping other players as well. All right, everybody, that's it for today. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Have a good one.